As I'm sure some of you already know, this year I started a literary prize, rather grandly named the Republic of Consciousness Prize for Small Presses. And the point of this prize was to support small presses who, at great financial risk, publish ambitious and difficult fiction. And I just wanted to create a way of A, giving the books more exposure, and B, through the prize fund, which I'm still trying to crowdfund through my own initiative, which will be on your screen now and underneath here in the box. A little financial help. But anyway, 6 months of reading. I think we received, there's 8 judges. I think we received just over 50 novels. And we have a shortlist now of 16 presses, because essentially the prize goes to the press rather than the novel. And that will be whittled down to 6 in January, and then we will have a winner in March, at which point the prize will start over again for 2017. I should say here that there were many great novels that haven't made it onto the shortlist from presses. And the reason that is because this is trying to support ambitious and difficult work that push at the boundaries of what fiction might do. And of course, we got novels that were very well written and very interesting and great storytelling and great acts of imagination and such like, but they were more conventional and therefore pose less of a risk in commissioning and publishing. And if we look back at the Man Booker this year, his bloody project outsold all of the shortlist by about 5 to 1. And that was by a very small press, tiny small press, 2 people in Scotland. But it was essentially genre writing. It was a crime novel. It was an interesting crime novel, but it didn't do anything that is going to it didn't do anything new or exciting or unique or original or whatever. It was just a good story well told. And that's the reason some things didn't make it onto our shortlist, or our long list rather, because as good as they were more conventional. I have written a whole piece at Review 31 on this if you want to look at that. It'll probably be a little more cogent than me rambling on here, but I'm going to ramble on here. And I'm not going to do it in alphabetical order on there. This won't be in alphabetical order, but the order shouldn't give anything away. And plus, I am only one of 8 judges, which means what I think isn't necessarily going to influence the shortlist. So I'm going to start with this, which is called Lightbox by KJ Orr, which is her first volume of short stories. She just won the National Short Story Prize in the UK with a prize fund of £15,000 for what actually I think is the weakest story in this collection. She's a very interesting writer. I call her in the piece I wrote a sort of aristocratic writer, in the sense that there is not a touch of the sentimental in there. She's all about technique and precision, and so these short stories are very well told and very well made, but they also keep themselves at a distance. They don't ingratiate in any way. And I think that's why they've made it onto the long list here, is because she's trying to do something which I think actually means the reader has to work a little harder to find the kind of heart of the story. And lots of short stories do wear their subjects on their sleeve slightly too obviously, and she doesn't do that. And therefore they're kind of tough. But yeah, so that's that. Actually, I'm just going to move the microphone a bit nearer so you can hear some clunking. Right. Actually, I'm just going to check the microphone as well. Sound has probably got a bit better. Okay. The next one is called The Marvelous Equations of the Dread by Marcia Douglas, published by People Tree, which specialises in Caribbean and Black British fiction. This is extraordinary. Now, it is one of the most sort of magical books. Yes, it is magical realism, but there's something very, very extraordinary about this. It's about Jamaica, it's about reggae music, it's about Bob Marley, but it has such invention that there is that while I'm reading it, I'm just sort of surprised every single chapter. Yes, it slightly does take Rastafarianism or presents Rastafarianism without a critical eye, but its scriptural references and engagement is very intriguing and very interesting. But it's just a joyously written and hugely imaginative and inventive novel about a subject that doesn't get written about hugely. Although I say that, obviously, the book before last was set around that time, but this is a very different book indeed. From Pyrini Press, there is The Empress and the Cake by Linda Stiff. This is a very short novel, and it's interesting. It's about what makes it such a kind of intriguing read is it has that kind of weird otherness that there's a lot of books here. Weird otherness that sort of Middle European literature has. I mean, it goes back before Kafka, but there is this sense here that things are never quite what they're seen, even though obviously the kind of haute bourgeois of Austria have a sort of outwardly incredibly straight sensibility, and this is really how someone becomes controlled by the oddness of that sort of weird, slightly kind of uncanny Freudian, weirdness of Vienna. I mean, some of these I've already talked about. Dodge and Burn by Serafina Madsen, published by Dodo Inc. I say in my piece for Review 31 that it's on the road for the rave generation written by a woman. But some of the prose is so wonderful. But actually what she does, which feels really original, is her commitment to the different cultures striving for kind of transcendental experiences. So rather than just a kind of homage to a kind of drug culture, it does something more than that. But it does it with such great writing, and this is a book that people are really going to love, I think, and I think hopefully it'll certainly find cult status, but I think it deserves more than that. Treat by Lara Williams. Now I'm going to have to say I hate the name and I hate the cover, but it does something, and it is true that this is probably the most conventional piece of writing in the prize. But the reason it made it onto the long list is A, because the writing is so fine, but B, I think is it does take those subject matters that have been sort of appropriated by modestly sophisticated chick lit, and it does something more honest and more sort of cynical is the wrong word, pessimistic is the wrong word, but kind of real and there's a kind of truth-seeking about it that actually gives back the kind of artistry, the literary artistry of that subject matter. It gives it back and reappropriates it from that kind of chick lit. And I think that's a very important and quite a brave thing to do. From Tangerine Press, Glue Ponies by Chris Wilson. Chris Wilson, I mean, this stuff these are short stories about the underbelly of drug and criminal culture. I mean, this is a man who basically, he was born in Newcastle upon Tyne, but spent a lot of years in streets and prisons of the US as a drug addict and petty criminal, and that's what we've got here. Born on a Tuesday by L. Nathan John by Cassava Republic. This is I say in my piece, a deceptively simple novel. It's told in the sort of very straight oral tradition of African storytelling, but we forget very quickly how shocking the opening is, and how shocking, and therefore we're lulled into a kind of sense that this is a gentle story about a young man's sort of coming of age in a complicated religious situation in West Africa, in Nigeria, and therefore the third act, which is very shocking, comes as a surprise. But I think the key thing for this is that it's an incredibly well crafted novel, and therefore we actually we inhabit a world in a way that great storytelling can do, but it's actually dealing with some very dark themes, and we get a sense of the deep emotional chaos in religious life in West Africa. We now have from Holland House, The Storyteller by Kate Armstrong. I have to say, not a particularly well published book, but this is a very brave first novel, because essentially it is about a woman suffering from terrible depression. She has complete, what is technically called, a kind of lack of affect. She can't engage with the world. But the strength of this is in the writing, is that Kate Armstrong knows how to pivot between making very clear how this woman doesn't feel and how opaque the world is presented to her, and that's a real technical achievement. Solar Bones, which I've spoken about, by Mike McCormack, which won the Goldsmiths on Wednesday, which I was hugely pleased about. I was there and I could congratulate him and whatever, but this is just, I've talked about this before, but it's written in a single sentence, and it is essentially about a very local and small story about a man and his family, but the form unlocks how a kind of deep poignancy about individual lives, while at the same time juxtaposes these lives against his vision of the world, which unlocks something more profound and greater. And it's just a fantastic novel. If you haven't read it and you like formally interesting novels that genuinely move you, this is one to read. Counter narratives, John Keane. I've talked about this before. These are short stories and novellas, taking essentially the slave experience of the last 4 centuries in North and South America, and using the kind of vectors of newspaper articles, journals, novels, retells in a fictional form, the history of the slave trade and all of those things that um, um, all all of those things that it influenced across those decades, and it's just a formidable piece of writing, of intellectual ambition, and an absolute joy to read. We're almost done. Well, almost. I've talked about this before. Anakana, Schofield's Martin John, a very brave novel. It's about a man who exposes himself in public, and it's written in what I call sort of dream, plain chant, poem, just fractured prose. But it's given the complications or the complicated nature of the protagonist. It's a novel that doesn't have any judgment, but it discloses what it must be like to exist in that world. Crude by Sally O'Reilly, published by Eros Press, which and this is a satire and very funny book about art criticism and artists, and it's essentially about the world has been completely appropriated by theorists, and it's very funny. Find by Diane Williams, published by Charles Boyle Editions. These are very short stories written by one of the leading avant-garde writers of the US. And if you're ever looking for a writer to just question how you perceive the world, and that we all perceive the world in our odd ways, and the world moves in and out of focus in a way that we can't often articulate, these short stories do it. If they were 1% odder, they would be almost nonsense. But as it is, she's doing something so subtle that we read it and go, I just get this. But what a strange world we live in. This is a proof copy, Forbidden Line by Gallibegger, and there's no doubt it's the most nuts novel on our long list. It is a modern retelling of Don Quixote, using the historical scenario of the 14th century peasants' revolt being reenacted in 21st century London, although it doesn't obey any principles of temporality at all the way through it. We could be in the 14th century, we could be in the 21st century, could be anywhere in between. This writer doesn't care about that. It is a novel of ideas, it is beautifully written, possibly a work of genius, but it is completely nuts. And then finally, Beautiful Pictures of the Lost Homeland by Mia Gallagher, published by New Ireland. It's a very big novel, which I'm rereading at the moment. This is a novel of identity, and it has a number of narratives. It's mostly set in Ireland, but all the way through it's interpolated or interpreted, in whatever the word is, I can't remember, with this extraordinary focus. It's called the Museum of Curiosities, but it's a focus on how Czechoslovakia or Bohemia and Moravia have shifted over the centuries. And I suspect it's a way of looking at the island of Ireland as well, even though it is entirely the history of that bit of the European landmass. But at the same time, it's the story of a boy who transitions to a woman. But the most moving part of this novel is the extended narrative, which goes all the way through of this boy um, who the writer gives the pronoun she because he will become a she, but she is about 8 years old, and in this, the child of a loveless marriage where the mother has terminal cancer. And what's so extraordinary about this novel is how Mia Gallagher writes with such unaffective and unsentimental tenderness about what it must be like to be the child of a dying mother, where the dynamic between the three of them, mother, father, child, there isn't any real love. And so you're facing what from the outside seems like the most tragic and emotional situation, but sometimes it can be very complicated because the husband and wife might not love each other. Then what happens when you? I don't know. It's brilliant on this. I mean, as good as any novel I've ever read. And there's lots more to it as well because it's a very big book. But that's the pretty long list. It's 16. I can't recommend them all enough. Not all of them will be for everyone, but there should be something for everyone if you're interested in challenging, difficult, ambitious literature. That's it. Thank you.